guys, so now we're diving into the formal analysis part of art appreciation. Here we're going to take all that we've learned so far. We've identified elements and principles of design. We've looked at media. And now we're going to look at some additional identifiers that are going to help us understand art, especially form, subject matter, and content. Now, a formal or critical analysis means that we're going to examine an artwork by how those elements and principles of design are used. In addition to using the elements and designs to dissect an artwork, we're also going to use representation and style. Now, when we talk about forms of art, it can get very confusing. Sometimes a three-dimensional object is considered a form. But if you think about form as the way that an artist is representing the subject matter that they're choosing to, might help a little bit more. So basically, the forms of art that we're going to be talking about is representational, abstract, idealized, and non-representational or non-objective. Representation is a really broad category that refers to how we look at the world. Representational art looks like some part of the world as we know it, exactly as we know it. Idealism in art encourages imagination. It attempts to realize a mental conception of beauty, a standard of perfection, the perfect woman, the perfect leader. Abstract art departs from reality, but not completely. Abstraction takes liberties. It may change the form or the color of an object, but we can still identify the object for the most part, but it isn't trying to look real. Here's an example of the difference between representational art and abstracted art. On the left, you have a very realistic imagery of cows. On the right-hand side, Franz Marc takes some liberties with the colors of the cows and the way the cows are acting and things like that. Here again, we have the very same subject matter, just depicted in two different ways. The one on the left, Masked Company, is very realistic, so that would be representational art. On the right-hand side is Picasso's Portrait of Three Musicians. It is abstracted. We can still tell what it is, but it's just not in a realistic manner exactly how we would see it if we saw it for real. Now, idealization is still a form of representation, but it isn't to the extreme of abstraction. It's not a complete realistic version of something. Idealization occurs when an artist treats the subject of the artwork with a mindset of perfection rather than completely realistic. Again, we've all heard talk about the ideal man, the ideal woman, what they should look like. But we also know there's no such thing. Now, the Egyptian pharaohs were thought to be like the gods, so they were always portrayed with the perfect body shape, perfect face, etc. Now, Khafra, enthroned, is a 4th dynasty Egyptian sculpture from around 2570 BC. Now, this isn't what he actually looked like, but it is an idealized representation. The stone itself was floated on the Nile for 400 miles. The use of this stone indicated that he was very important and powerful. Remember talking about that, the type of media used in chapter 3? The seated pose is very rigid, showing Khafra with an idealized physique. The sculpture is very symmetrical. It's indicating order and control. And the headdress and beard are perfect, as a pharaoh who is thought to be godlike should be. The blocky nature of the sculptures during this time period ensured that no part of the figure could ever be broken off. Now, Kouros was an early Greek figure of a young male. Now you can see the Egyptian influence and the reliance on geometric shapes to define the contours of the bodies. Now, as we progress in time, that would be from the left to the right of those images, the figures start to become more realistic with more accurate body proportions. Critias boy is really the beginning of the classical Greek style. That's the third one. It's less rigid with the beginning of contrapposto, which is an asymmetrical pose. Dorophoros, which means spear bearer, which is the fourth one there, uses a contrapposto pose and the classical realism that the Greeks were known for. So you can see how the representation of people has changed throughout the years. So while abstraction served to streamline or de-emphasize certain real-world references, ultimately one could still see some real-world reference. In the late 1800s, Alexander Rodchenko coined the term non-objective art. Here, the object of the art was to not have an object at all. You can see that Piet Mondrian broke things down to very basic elements of design, colors, shape, line, and used those to create their compositions. Black Square by Malevich is just that. That's as minimal as you can possibly get. Now, artists like Wassily Kandinsky, they like to explore color theory as it related to music, logic, emotion, and even spirituality. Style refers to the general way that we categorize art. We group music into genres like rap, hip hop, jazz, rock, or country because they have similar sounds. Art can also be categorized into styles that share similar features. Typically, art is grouped by time periods or by culture. Some of the styles we're going to talk about in this chapter include the cultural styles of the ancient Near East, ancient Greek and Rome, the Indian subcontinent, and then Romanesque Gothic eras in Europe. The stylistic periods or movements, we'll look at Italian Renaissance, Realism, Expressionism, Abstract Expressionism, and then we'll look at some individual style. Now, these aren't the only styles. These are just a few that we're going to hit on here. Now, styles of art from the ancient Near East, which are very, very old pieces of artwork, you can kind of gather those all together. The figures appear very static, that you see multiple viewpoints at the same time. There's a hierarchical proportion that's done there. Some of the most interesting artworks, in my opinion, are those that come from the ancient Near East. Now, here on the left, in the ancient Near East, we're seeing art produced from 2600 to 2400 BC in Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia was considered the cradle of civilization. So figures of this period show enough detail that we can see that the subject of the artwork are human bodies. Here again, like the early Greek sculptures, figures are very static, very stiff. We can also see in the standard of which is on the left-hand side, the figures use multiple points of view at the same time, kind of like Picasso's Cubist figures. Now, showing space is also very rudimentary, mostly shown by overlapping figures, but not much else. Hierarchical proportion is used, so the greater or more prominent the figure, the larger their figures are in relationship to those of a lower status. Now, some of the best known indicators of previous cultures are the ruins of Greece and Rome. This period is generally called the classical period, classical era, classical style. And on the next couple of slides, we're going to see some examples of that. Now, this example of pottery is probably one of the best known remnants of ancient Greece. This is called black figure pottery, which was red clay with black designs painted on them. There's also the opposite. This black figure pottery shows mythological figures. Now, after the high classical era of Greek artwork, statues and sculpture in particular become more expressive and more emotional. Art becomes more dynamic, more expressive, um, sometimes even emotional and dramatic are really exaggerated in some ways. Later Greek culture will show political influence as well as influence from foreign countries. So Rome sought to imitate Greece. The early Roman periods overlap the late Greek periods. And during this time, the Romans favored anti-idealized approaches to portraying people. This went way past naturalism into a very intense study of individuals and an intense study of the human body. Ancestors were honored. People kept their images as portrait heads, which to me is kind of creepy, but with the rise of Augustus to emperor, the practice of idealization came into play again. Regardless of the actual age of the emperor, his statues always portray a youthful and physically fit Augustus who was heroic in stature. Now, during the late Roman Empire period, the naturalistic representations of the humor became more idealized, spiritual, and philosophical. Now, here we're going to start talking about the Indian subcontinent and the cultural styles of their art, which you are going to be able to see really are mixing a lot of different styles together. During the reign of the Emperor Ashoka, 84,000 stupas or shrines were built to house religious artifacts. Trade with Western cultures brought some of the artistic styles of Greece and Rome to India. While Greece and Rome were the classic civilizations in the West, similar ways of representation start to appear in India. Now, in India, most of the statues and sculptures show some influence of Roman Greek while maintaining the Indian idea of the perfect figure, more robust, more full-bodied. Right, we're jumping back to Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries to talk about the Romanesque period. It's also been called the Middle Ages. Romanesque artwork puts the emphasis on Christianity and the end times. Very focused on spiritual aspects. So artwork was more abstracted to indicate spiritual turmoil or agitation. Architecture is highly decorative, but it's very blocky. The Gothic era follows with another return to naturalism, focusing on the natural world. The physical facts of figures will now lay the groundwork for the Renaissance. Here, the representation of art in Italy began to go separate ways with the Gothic art of Northern Europe, where the Gothic style actually prevailed until around the 16th century. Now, there's a great deal of overlap between cultural and stylistic periods. Stylistic groupings tend to focus on similarities in a common subject matter, an approach, spiritual or political elements. And humanism was a shared concept that people were inherently good and problems could always be solved by reason. The Italian Renaissance was a period of about 1,500 years that led to an artistic and scientific boom. Artists drew on the classical past, but there was a tremendous focus on the human form. Leonardo da Vinci spent long hours studying the human body, trying to understand the relationships between the muscles, the tendons, the bones. This was also a time where artists wanted to express space in their artwork with a new scientific procedure. And so linear perspective was born. Linear perspective allowed the viewers to feel like they were actually part of the artwork. Now, religious artwork dominated the scene because most of the artwork during this time was commissioned by the church for the church. It was also time of uber wealthy friends that could afford to have an experienced artist create art for them. Artists at this point had a very high stature in the Renaissance. And by the way, this was the time of the original Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael. Now, for the most part, naturalism and realism are interchangeable terms. There's such a fine line between naturalism and realism that we're just going to combine them into one. Now, realism has been prevalent in art at various times. Realism attempts to show the world just as it is, exactly as it is, avoiding any kind of stylization. Now, there was a European and an American movement in realism, and they are designated that way. Now, Expressionism chooses to move away from realism, reflecting the need of artists to express ideas or feelings that can't be expressed in a naturalistic manner. Artists favored the emotional content of the art rather than the subject matter itself. Expressionism is very subjective, giving each artist their own version or image of what expressionism is. Expressionism can reflect the ideas of the artist only, or it could reflect the ideas of an entire society. Expressionism in Germany in the early 20th century reflected the reactions of a society to the political and cultural unrest at that time. And who hasn't felt like the figure in The Scream by Edward Munch? Abstract Expressionism was the first specifically American movement to achieve global status. Here, the focus was exclusively on the medium and the action of using that medium. This style is the one that is most often viewed with the expression, well, I could have done that. Some artists have such a distinctive style, it becomes very easy to recognize their work. Their choice of lighting, technique, colors, subject matter could be the identifying factor. Rembrandt and Seurat are only two of the many artists that can be identified by their individual styles. Now, by narrowing our focus to only elements and principles of design might sound really boring, but it is one of the first steps in decoding an artwork. Now, the formal analysis that we're going to be doing has four parts. It has a description, analysis, interpretation, and the evaluation or the judgment of the artwork. Okay, the description of a formal analysis is very simply, what do you see? What's the subject matter? Subject matter is always what the artwork is about. Is the artwork 2D or 3D? What form is used? And remember, in this case, we're talking about representationalism, abstract, non-representational. What's the medium or media? Identify specific things. What are the relationships between the objects? How is the space organized? In this case, we're going to take a look at the Diego Rivera painting, The Flower Vendor, to do a rough formal analysis. So when you look at this piece of artwork, what do you see when you first look at it? What's the subject matter? Sometimes the title of the artwork will give you an idea about that. Subject matter, 2D, 3D. You can go down the list and give a description of the artwork. And if you would, imagine that you're going to give your description of an artwork to someone who's never seen it, and they're going to find that artwork in a gallery based only on the description that you give them. That's a description. Okay, the analysis section is where we're really going to plug in the elements and principles of design. So what elements of design are used in the artwork? Where are they used? How are they organized? That would be the principles of design. If it's 2D, what, if anything, is used to create the illusion of space? If it's 3D, how does the work occupy space? What creates unity and variety? What's the scale of the work? What's used to create emphasis? So now take a couple of minutes and just take a look at The Flower Vendor by Diego Rivera and see what you can find. Okay, the interpretation or the content of an artwork is what the artist is trying to tell us. Now, that interpretation comes as much from the viewer as it does from the artist. We don't always know what the artist was thinking when they painted something. So sometimes we have to try to interpret it for them. What do you think the artwork meant to the artist? What do you think the artwork means to the viewer? Now, the interpretation of an artwork could change as that artwork is studied further. And sometimes new things are noticed each time the artwork is viewed that could change that content. Now, in a formal or critical analysis, there must be an interpretation. Even if it doesn't seem like it, I don't know is not an acceptable answer. So what do you think the artist is trying to tell us through this artwork? What's the story behind it? Now, the evaluation or the judgment portion of the critical analysis is where you take everything you've learned about the artist and the artwork, and you decide if the artist was successful in creating a well-organized artwork. You then get to decide, do you like the artwork? Why or why not? It's okay if you don't like it. I want you to be able to explain why you don't. So look at The Flower Vendor by Diego Rivera. What do you think? Do you think that the artist did a good job? Do you like the artwork? If you do like it, can you tell me why? If you don't like it, can you tell me why?